Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 62, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. This will be the last podcast episode of 2024. I'm planning to take a few weeks off around Christmas to wrap up a few end-of-year projects and get myself all set for 2025. It's about a week before Christmas, and my sojo seems to have started its Christmas break early. I'm finding that I'm really having trouble getting enthused about any projects. I did finish 2 more Kids Adventure Jacket hoodies for my friend Susan's grandsons. The first 2 that I made for them were a little bit big because Auntie Janet overestimated their sizes. So I made them 2 additional jackets in smaller sizes, and they requested train fabric. They're very into construction equipment and trains. So the first jackets were construction trucks, heavy equipment, and the second set of hoodies was with train fabric. So I gave them their hoodies yesterday at church, and by the end of the service, they were both wearing them, so I think they were a hit. I do like that pattern, and I expect that I'll be making more hoodies for them as they get bigger and bigger. I have no doubt that my sojo will return, probably after Christmas. I am also the pianist at our church, and we have a choir piece that I need to work up, so that's going to take up a fair bit of my time this week. So there's lots of things competing for my attention right now, and sewing may just have to go to the back burner for a little bit, and that's fine. I'm going to jump right into today's interview because it's a little on the long side again, and I don't want to take up a whole lot of time chatting at the beginning of the podcast. So I will let you know that my guest today is Susan Skalak. Susan studied mechanical design in college and eventually went on to earn a PhD in mechanical engineering. As many of us women do, she took time off from her career to raise her kids and rediscovered a love of sewing. She's also very interested in the local fiber movement. And if you haven't yet listened to the episode about Fibersheds, I would encourage you to go back and check that episode out. I talked to Elena Raisley, who is very involved with the Montana Fibershed. Susan Skalak was living in Washington State, and she and her husband, after her younger child went off to college, she and her husband moved back to Virginia, which is the area where they're originally from. They bought a farm, acquired some sheep and goats, and now Susan is making custom clothing produced from start to finish with local materials and locally grown fiber. So I will let her explain all of that in more detail, and I think that you will enjoy our conversation. So I'm here today with Susan Skalak, and we are going to have a talk that's probably going to range far and wide.
That's probably true.
From sewing to animals to all sorts of interesting things. So we'll go ahead and get started. So Susan, how did you learn to sew and who taught you?
I had to take home ec, and it was a miserable experience, and I swore I'd never sew again. So that's how I came to be. I was a tomboy and spent time in the woods with my dad, and he was a forester, and my mom was a sewer and a knitter. And so I didn't touch sewing again until I graduated from engineering school and had an engineering degree, but no job, and I had to move home. So I was at home getting super bored, and then basically my mom said, "Oh, there's this fabric store down the road. Why don't you come with me?" And I had started looking around at stuff, and this woman from Switzerland, she was American, but her husband had worked in Switzerland for many years and opened this amazing fabric store in the 1980s in Greenville, South Carolina. And so I basically started going over there and took tailoring lessons and just bought gorgeous fabric from mostly from Europe when it was still really when you could really still get stuff at a really nice price. And yeah, so that's how I really learned to sew, with that 6 months I spent at home before I started, before I ended up in graduate school.
So home sounds like it was on the East Coast?
Yeah, so South Carolina. Yeah, that's where my dad moved a lot. We moved around a lot when I was a kid, and we ended up there for high school. So, and
Okay.
they stayed there till they passed away. But yeah, so
So you had an engineering degree that
yeah,
and from there you went to I know you ended up out west at some point. So,
yeah. Well, I from there I got a master's degree at Clemson, and then I got a job before I even had my degree, and ended up as a robotics engineer building printers. So we had an automated printer line, and I got two of the stations, and I did, it was like a big, not like a person looking robot. It was just like a big, sort of like, almost like long arm knitting machine, or not knitting machine, long arm quilter, except that the gantry was above your head. And so the robot just had an arm that hung from this big, square, rectangular support system, and it moved up and down and went in every direction. And we taught it how to build printers. So it was pretty interesting.
wow. Where was that?
That was in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Okay. Okay.
And
People
then,
people don't
I
think of
had a career quite a bit for IBM, and then they started going towards software, and I ended up going back to school and getting a PhD in design.
okay.
And then I taught at a university for 6 years, and there was no maternity leave policy at that time. So it was like you got 6 weeks of disability leave. And the unwritten rule was, oh, you should get pregnant so that you are teach your classes in the summer. And then, or sorry, you teach your classes during the year and you have your kids in the summer. And then once you do that, there was no part time. If you did part time, you lost all your benefits. My husband was a full-time academic also, and we were just like, this is crazy, because we either one of us stays home and raises the kids, and or we hire somebody to do that. And I ended up staying home, and then sort of went on a different path.
People don't generally think of technical degrees or technical professions and sewing as being compatible, but I see a lot of overlap. So you must have found a way to redirect your interest in engineering and design into sewing.
Well, it's interesting because, like, I usually people I meet and they go, "Oh, you're an engineer and you sew. You must be a quilter because quilting is so exact." And I'm like, "No, I hate quilt. I mean, I don't hate quilting. I like improv, but I don't like traditional quilting because I really don't enjoy precise cutting. But I love garment sewing, and I love the idea of going from a 2D, um, having the pattern be 2D and taking it to 3D and figuring out how it all goes together. And it fits really well as engineers. And it's amazing how many women engineers I've met who sew. So not, it's more than you think.
Hmm.
And I've met many men who sew, especially when I lived in Bainbridge Island, Washington. And we had a lot of men customers who were really into sewing and really enjoyed the challenge of it. And, we had one guy that I sold, fabric and buttons and stuff to, who enjoyed making these. He had something like 500 Hawaiian shirts, like that sort of, you know, um, stuff that wasn't buttoned down, but, just the short sleeve. And he picked out crazy fabrics and designed all these shirts, and he just had a bunch of them.
Were you sewing when you were at home with your kids?
I did. And which was fun, but once he got to be about 4, he wanted to be a soccer player, and he was basically into athletic wear. So all he wanted was athletic shorts and t-shirts, and so that was pretty much the end of it. And I had sent him a bunch of cute little shorts and stuff, And then my daughter came along and she wore a lot of his clothes. And then then she became sort of a girly girl. I just started making dresses for her. And I have to say, my first few were not so good because I was out of practice. But pretty soon I got pretty good at it. And it was fun and they were quick and they were pretty easy. And she was very opinionated, even before she was really verbal. I had made her this dress that had stripes on it, and she refused to put it on. She was like 2. And I swapped out the top and put flowers on it. And she held up her arms and said, yeah, put that on me. So, and she's still opinionated at 21. So, and I'm still making her clothes. Now she's 6 feet tall and she can't find jeans to fit her. So I think I've made her like 6 or 7 pairs of jeans.
Talk a little bit about, I know that you you were in the Seattle area for a while. You worked at Esther's Fabrics on Bainbridge Island, and I was just there a couple of weeks ago. And you also know Rylas Bode down at the Sewing and
Yeah,
Design
I
School in
do.
Tacoma. So talk a little bit about your experiences there.
We moved from here at the end of 2014, like the day after Christmas. My husband took a job in Seattle and we found Bainbridge Island because I had a horse and the kids were used to living on a farm. And it was just, we had looked in Seattle and it was like a major culture shock thinking we're pulling our kids out of middle school and my son's about to start high school. And to ask them then to like live in a really urban area, we ended up finding Bainbridge, and so we moved there, and had been there for I don't know, like probably a year and a half, and Esther's went up for sale, and so I had been going and buying stuff and making clothes for Studio Tour there, and I just went. My husband and I went out to dinner, and I said, so I really want to buy this fabric store. And he goes, what? He goes, where does this come from? And I said, well, I really enjoy sewing and I don't want it to close. And I think I can really do a good job. And he's like, yeah, let me think about this. So he took the weekend and he came back and he says, well, if this is what you really want to do, that's fine. So I bought it. And one of my best friends at that point was living on Bainbridge. We had met the first day we moved into like the first week. She had also moved to Bainbridge, Virginia. So there were 2 of us there. She didn't come from the same town I did, and we bonded over sewing. And so I called her up and I said, I'm going to do this. Can you help me? Because her family her aunt owned In the Beginning Fabrics, and her
Uh-huh.
cousin Jason still owns it. And she had grown up working In the Beginning when it was a fabric store, and she was a fabric designer, and so she came in and helped me, and I don't know what I would have done without her. She and the woman that has been part of that store for ages, Allison Garrison, and Allison, the 2 of them kind of just helped me because I'd never owned a retail store before. I mean, I had done budgeting. I mean, as a faculty member, you have to write grants. So I knew how to budget and I knew how to run websites. And I had, written my own code for websites and all kinds of that kind of thing as sort of quote marketing yourself and paying other people and as running a lab and engineering. But, the retail part of how do you pick the fabrics and all that stuff, which ended up, I loved that and it's fun. And what I ended up doing is having, whoever was around in the store, I said, if you want to come, the people that work there, I was like, we're going to pick fabrics, In the Beginning is coming today, or, yeah, we had a couple of wonderful reps who repped across a bunch of different companies, of course, and then they like Free Spirit and all that. And so we would just end up picking fabrics together and arguing over like this colorway or that colorway. And that was the most fun of that. And going to fabric shows and the quilt fair were the best parts of owning the store.
Did you
So
concentrate mostly on quilting fabric or did you also have apparel fabric?
it was probably 60-40. It was 60% quilting and 40% um, apparel fabric. Because I knew how to quilt, but not really well. And I was an improv quilter and I made quilts scraps that I had left over from kids' clothes or whatever, and for baby quilts that I gave to friends. But I was not a real quilter and did not know how to really do the exact cutting and the traditional piecing. And so I taught myself how to do that, and then um, learned how to do that and did a lot of quilts and then designed a few quilts. And eventually we bought a long arm quilter and I learned the long arm, which was a lot of fun. And but yeah, I still my love is garment sewing. It's just I really love garment sewing.
So I'm going to ask you a question about for our listeners who may not know that area, to get to Bainbridge Island from Seattle, you have to take a ferry. Was your customer base seasonal? Were you
It
pretty
was
steady
actually.
with, because I know Bainbridge gets a lot of seasonal traffic, but did you get a lot
That
of people coming
was
over from Seattle as well?
Yes. Well, we got a lot of people coming sort of from around the area, but we got a lot of cruise traffic. So
Okay.
the cruise ships really helped our business. And yeah, without um, all the tourists that came there, it would have been hard to make a year round, make a living out of it. Not that I really made a living out of it, but to be able to pay people and be able to keep the store going, it
Sure.
would have been very difficult without that traffic.
Okay.
So
I hadn't considered the cruise traffic, so that's interesting. So
no, it was a big factor. Yeah,
how long did you have Esther's Fabrics?
just shy of 5 years.
Okay.
And what happened was that just I got the business through COVID, and paid all my staff through COVID, and
Which
I
is an
was lucky enough to
accomplishment.
get, yeah, lucky enough. I mean, it was down to the last few dollars, and I got a small business loan, and we did, like all fabric businesses did. We pivoted and started making mass kits, and I have a photo of my daughter on spring break from her Zoom classes. Um, Helping me, and we would put the kits up with people's names on them and tape them to the outside window, and people would come pick them up.
Wow.
And we had the whole front window of the store completely covered in brown paper bags. And she and I did this for like an entire week, and then I did it by myself, and I was the only one in the store. And then eventually what happened was we decided we needed to go online because we were still shut down. And so I had people come in shifts. So they would pick a day and they would come in and do the kits and put them out. And then I worked with one of the other women who owns the store now, Piper. She and I developed the whole website and put stuff on and then got everything online. And so that was a big transition for us, which I had been trying to do, but it wasn't a priority. But, when you're forced to and COVID shuts you down, it's what we did. And
Right.
so it ended up actually being super helpful for the store.
When you sold Esther's Fabrics, your kids were probably out of high school at that point or close to being out of high school.
No, I mean, that's the other reason I sold. So my son was in college, but my daughter was just going into her senior year. And that's part of the other reason I decided to do it, is I felt like my kids were leaving. It was a transition time, or my son had left, but and I realized that I didn't have a lot of memory of what went on my son's senior year. And I just thought, this is my youngest, and I just really want to spend time with her. And she had been rowing for 3 years, and starting into her senior year was still rowing. And I had been to very few regattas because they were usually on the days that I worked. And so I worked Sundays. And so I just decided this is time. I want to spend time with her before she leaves. And that's not something I regret at all.
I did the same thing. I was traveling a lot and teaching knitting classes. And when my older daughter got into high school, I thought, this is it. I need to be here. So you sold Esther's Fabrics. I'm assuming you continued to sew. And did you have horses
Yeah.
on Bainbridge Island, or when did you start getting into
I
sheep?
had one horse. Yeah. I brought one horse with me to Bainbridge. Yeah, this is the whole like starting during COVID because we knew Lyndon was graduating. My husband was working in a job where he could work from anywhere. and he had left the Seattle Foundation, and he had taken a different job and was working remotely. And before 2 years before COVID, he was working remotely. So we were talking about like what's next, and I had gone in quotes to the LA Textile Show, which was online during COVID. And I was starting to think like, what do I want to do next? I love this, but I'm thinking, things are changing. I'm trying to decide. And I saw this felting machine, and it was a flatbed felting machine. And one of the things that I had thought about when I was selling fabric, and especially, was that 99.9% of our fabric came from overseas, and most of it from India and China. Um, maybe 10% from Italy or some other European country, but like the linen usually came from Eastern Europe. But a lot of it also linen came from China. And it was in the back of my mind, and it was bothering me. I as an engineer and as a researcher, I did work in sustainability and design for environment, and design for repairability, and that kind of thing is what I studied. And I just started thinking, this is not a good thing. And I had fallen into the LA textile like show and going to picking out different things on Zoom. And I had also heard a podcast, and I don't remember which one now, but about Fibershed. And so then I got interested in Fibershed and figuring out, Fibershed is the idea of sort of like local food movement. So we should eat locally. Fibershed is we should grow our own fabric, more or less, wool, flax, cotton, and make it here in the United States again. Because when I was a little kid, I remember going to Florence, Alabama with my mom, and she would be buying fabric, and Florence was the t-shirt capital of the world at that point. And now, a lot of people know Alabama Shannon or Natalie
Mm-hmm.
Shannon,
Mm-hmm.
but at that point, it was fully employed. My aunt worked for Dan River in Danville, Virginia, and she came up as a textile employee, and all those jobs were gone. And I had a friend in college who was one of my roommates. Her family had had textile mills and made socks for, I don't know, 2 or 3 generations, and they had gone bankrupt. So now there were no more socks, and it really personally impacted me. And I just thought, this is something, I can see that I really want to do Fibershed. And when I saw this felter, and I was like, oh, this is so cool, because I could make my own boiled wool instead of buying it from Italy. And so I just got this in my head, and I learned more and more about Fibershed, and I started calling around about needle felters, and like, who has a needle felter and how can I find one? And then I decided, okay, if we are going to do, my husband and I talked about what next. And I said, well, I have this crazy idea, but I would like to have a sheep farm and raise sheep and make my own boiled wool for clothing. And he was like, oh, okay. And God bless him. It's like, he's like, okay. To be fair, I had been wanting sheep since I had quit work, before I had kids. And we were looking at sheep together and touring sheep farms in Charlottesville, which is where we ended back here. But he worked so much, and he was traveling on the road, and I got the flu and realized, okay, if he's gone and I get the flu and I have 2 kids under the age of 5, like, how is this going to work? And I was like, yeah, it's not. So I just delayed getting sheep, and we had chickens instead, and I had horses. And so it was just, turns out, although now I've learned that sheep are way easier than horses.
Yeah, we have pigs and chickens. And when we moved to Montana, I floated the idea of getting sheep because we lived in Pennsylvania for 5 years after we got married.
Yeah.
And we were just surrounded by sheep farms. So when we moved out here, I floated the idea of getting sheep. And he said, we might as well just put up a neon sign for the mountain lions and the coyotes that says diner, because we'll be providing all of the food for them. I assume you didn't get sheep while you were on Bainbridge. You waited till you got back to
No,
Virginia to get sheep.
Yeah, we looked for farms up and down the West Coast and up and down the East Coast, trying to figure out where we wanted to go back, where we wanted to end up. And then my husband, I came home and he goes, I found us a farm in Charlottesville. And I kind of laughed and it's like, okay. So we looked at it and then we flew out here and looked at the place. And he just is like, I love this place. This is amazing. So yeah, we put an offer on it and bought this farm. And so we have been living for the last 2 years in a veterinary clinic. The farm originally was a equine clinic. And so it had 40 acres in pasture and 50 acres in woods. And they had everything set up for horses. So there's a bunch of barns and, it has this veterinary clinic. And then, and at the time we bought it, which I think is the reason why we were able to get it, because farms were hard to find during there was a cidery in the clinic. So it was no longer an equine clinic, but had been a cidery, an apple cidery. And they were making hard cider and fermentation tanks in the surgery room. And
Wow.
in and they had the canner set up in the recovery room. And then they had their offices where we kind of first started out, you and I. And then somebody had built an apartment on the back side of that clinic. And so the farm manager was living in the little clinic, I mean, the little apartment. And so we bought it and stayed in Bainbridge till our daughter finished high school, which was not that many months. And then we had to give the cidery a year's notice before so they could have time to figure it out and move out. So we did that. And then um, they left at the beginning of August or middle of August, maybe. And then we had packed up the car and got in the car with the dog, and our daughter came with her then high school boyfriend, who was going to college on the East Coast. Our daughter's going to college on the East Coast, and we took a cross country drive in the end of August, and then took her to college. And then my husband and I moved into this little, you know, basically 2 bedroom, 1 bath apartment, and with a little tiny kitchen, and just yeah. And so this is where we've been living for 2 years till last month.
So you found your needle felting machine?
I have not. I found one in, yeah, so I did find one that I could use. I rented time on one in Bainbridge. It was in Woodinville,
Mm-hmm.
Washington. And I had ordered from an Etsy person, I ordered a bunch of little roving samples from a bunch of different types of sheep. So I went there one day and I laid out all this roving and I needle felted it. And then I came home and I washed it and looked at it and figured out, which breed of sheep do I want and what works and what doesn't and what would make outerwear and what has a good hand and what doesn't. And it pretty quickly came down to like Tunis sheep. I was looking at Clen Forest because there was somebody breeding Clen Forest here. I also looked at Gulf Coast native, but I really, really wanted the Tunis. They have a beautiful, beautiful wool, and people were really beginning to concentrate on breeding the sheep to have nice fleeces. They're heat resistant, so in Virginia, that's a really good thing, and they're parasite resistant. And so I was like, this is a great breed. They're great for beginners, so they're usually pretty easy care. And I had also heard a podcast where this woman, Cheris from Tar Heel Billy Farm, talked about the Tunis and how she had been breeding them for 10 years for quality of fleece, and that she bred old style Tunis, not show Tunis. So they were smaller sheep, really hardy. She wasn't worming them. They were super parasite resistant. And so I just really settled in on that breed. But I also knew that that breed and that sheep was going to make a coat that was really, really stiff. And so I wanted something with a little bit more drape. And so I had thought I was going to get alpaca because the alpaca It's just got a beautiful drape and a lovely sheen to it. But it's really hard to keep alpacas in the South. I mean, they just, everything I read, people talk about sheep dying, but alpacas really do just, they just have a really difficult time in this
Hmm.
climate. So I quickly decided alpaca was not for us, and ended up looking at mohair. And one of I at the time I went to visit this farm, I didn't realize what a icon she is in the Angora goat world. But this friend of mine, Pat Harder, has a nearby farm that she's raised Angora goats for 30 plus years. So I went to visit her, fell in love with her goats, and then dragged my husband over there, and he was pretty intrigued. And so we came home like 5 weeks later, we had five Angora goats. And I didn't, they always tell you this, but you have the infrastructure in place. And of course, I had been looking more at sheep than goats and didn't realize how delicate goats are. And so we had to get shelter for this movable. I wanted to rotate pastures, so I was using electric net, and it was just a major learning curve. So they came in November. I got my first shearing in January, and then then I went from there because the other problem is that I couldn't find any tunis. With COVID, people sold out of sheep. It was crazy. They couldn't, people were selling, they were like, oh, I have a waiting list for lambs. And so many people wanted sheep and wanted to go back to homesteading. It was really interesting. So I
Hmm.
had to wait for a year for my sheep.
Can you talk a little bit about how you go from your animals, the raw fleece to a finished product?
Yeah. I took my tunis to the Fall Fiber Festival near Montpelier. Anyway, one of the questions is, how long does it take you to make a coat? And I'm like, well, that's a hard question to answer. At what point do you want me to start? Let me
Right.
start at the beginning. And he's like, okay. And I said, well, first, you have to grow the lambs. And it takes a year for them to grow the sheep. And I could start to see him. He's like, sort of like already. And I said, now I mix that with with mohair. So my Angoras get shorn every 6 months. And so then I pick all the bad stuff out and I get it and I take it to a processor. And then takes 12 to 18 months to get it back from the processor. And he's like, well, this isn't exactly what had in mind. I said, well, I'm getting to that. And then, so, basically, so it does, it takes a while. I send it off. The first place I sent it to, I got mainly roving. I was looking for bats, and it's really difficult to find people that will, first of all, make a bat that's like quilt size. And second of all, it's really difficult to find somebody that will also handle mohair. So you're quickly limiting the number of people that can actually process your fiber with those two requirements. So I found one company, Xylingers, which was great. And they said, 6 months, which was fabulous. And I got my stuff in 3 months, and I was like, oh, this is awesome. And then I got an email that said Xylingers is closing. After 3 generations, the kids were done, and I was heartbroken because it was like I finally found a place there I could get what I wanted to be able to needle felt, and they're closed. So that's sort of another offshoot. But anyway, I get the bats, and then there's a local makerspace that has a flatbed needle felter. And I told my husband, he goes, why don't you just order it? I said, well, we have no space at this point because all of our worldly goods were in the. So I found a maker space in a town about 45 minutes from here. So I went over, had to take the orientation from the person who was running the machine to learn how to use it from her, and figuring out, what works and what doesn't work as far as making the felt. And the first stuff I made, I couldn't find a processor. It took me a while to follow it in Xylingers. So I had mohair, but no sheep for my tunis. So I bought fleeces from Maryland Sheep and Wool. I bought a Romney and a tunis sheep. And then I processed it all myself. So I scoured it. I, I picked it, I carded it through a long carding machine, and then I took it to the makerspace and I felted it. And
Wow. That's a lot of work.
yeah, so my first coat was completely hand done, which I'm in retrospect was a really good thing to do. I learned a lot, and I'm thankful because we have a fiber guild here, the Central Virginia Fiber Guild, that is an interesting mix of spinners, people who like to process fleece, a few sewers, and a lot of knitters and a lot of weavers. And so I found this weaving class, or not weaving, sorry, this fleece class from one of the women. And I took a fleece class from her and learned how to, recognize what you're looking for in a fleece, and how to process it, and all the different ways you can process it, and scour it. So that was a whole learning experience. So it's been quite a journey to, because I knew a lot of things, but then there was a whole world I did not know.
So you're making custom coats now? Do you concentrate just on coats or?
I am going to concentrate just on coats. So I am not selling any yet, but what I have been doing is perfecting the process. So I've figured out how to get a consistent felt now. So I can get a consistent white or gray felt. I had not started dyeing, but I wanted to get it so that I can get a consistent product. So when I put the pieces together, they're all the same thickness. Because the first one I made was a little thick and thin. It was a little harder to, figure out and get a consistent without the mechanized machinery that really has multiple carding drums. Because I just have the one, and it's really dependent on me doing that. And it's not easy to get a really consistent bat. It takes a lot of practice. Yeah, so the product that I got from Zeilingers can give me a really beautiful, consistent bat, which I can then needle felt super hot water, and I dry it in a dryer on hot. So I get kind of a boiled wool. So it's all the fibers are felted, because tunis doesn't like to felt. Mohair will felt some, but the two together, and it will give me, it's got a really nice sheen to it. It's got a really soft feel. It's squishy, and it's super warm, and it's amazingly light. So if anybody's made a boiled wool coat, it's so light and airy, yet really super warm. And so I've been concentrating on getting a consistent product, and from the material standpoint. And so I feel like I'm there with that. And now I am developing designs. So I've got two designs now that I've done. One sort of a short jacket with a shawl collar. I've got one with, I guess you would call them sort of like kimono sleeves, but I they come straight out. But then I have so they come straight out from the bodice in the front and the back, and then I have a big gusset underneath, and then cuffs on them. I think what I'm going to do next is a chore coat. So I'm going to have 3 designs, and I'll run from extra small to 2XL or whatever. And then you can pick and choose sort of, do you want a cuff? Do you want, which type of sleeve do you want? You want it long or short? So it'll be a semi-custom product, and I will just sort of make them on demand. So what I'm trying to do now is get enough made to get in the studio tour, and then take orders for them and have a few on the floor to sell. But that is my goal, because I know I'm never going to be a big fashion designer. I mean, what I'm trying to show is that as part of a fiber shed, it's possible to grow local fiber and make local goods. So I'm not really interested in running a big manufacturing facility, because I
Right.
like doing all parts of it, because I really love my sheep. Yesterday I had a bad day, so I just went out and hung out with them, and they, one by one will come up and poke me and sniff me and say hello and ask for a chin scratch. And
In terms
the
of
interesting,
construction, you're sewing them on a domestic sewing machine, I assume?
funny that you asked, because I was just about to say that. So
Okay.
I have made boiled wool coats before from fabric from Italy. And if you understand what that fabric is, it's basically a knit. So if you look at it really closely, it's knitted fabric with a very fine thread. If it's a double felted wool or a double wool, they will um, connect the two layers together. And then they put it through a hot steam process and then they full it. So they somehow, I don't know if they agitate it. I don't know exactly how they do that. But anyway, it's fulled and it behaves like a cross between a knit and a felt and a boiled wool. So it's not a true like Geiger jacket boiled wool. So it's what I got. And so mine is not quite like that. It's more Geiger like, which I've never really had worked with. But working with boiled wool is quite different because with a woven wool, it's like working with cotton or anything. Although I love sewing with wool because it's way more forgiving. So you have a lot more. It's easier to set in sleeves. It's easier to sort of, you know, make adjustments and use steam. And it's a lovely, lovely thing to sew with. And I really, if you're used to sewing with cotton, you should try wool because it's fun to sew with. Um, I found because of the thickness of the boiled wool, you have to do really simple seams. I mean, it's not like they're going to seam flat. It's not like you're going to press them and they tend to pop up. And I had taken a jacket class with Kenneth King, and I had brought a double face boiled wool that I had gotten at the store. And, just showed me a few tricks with boiled wool and how to sew with it. And I figured out how to do the seam. And what I do is that I take the boiled wool and I stitch it. I have a Janome HD9, which is amazing. So it only does straight stitch, but it will do 6 layers of denim. So I just sew with it. I seam the seams open, but of course they don't lay flat. So then what I do is I then, it's like sort of like flat felling, but not really, is that I open it up and I do a stitch on either side of the seam. And then I trim off the extra and it makes a really pretty inside of the coat. And it makes a beautiful just stitching detail on the outside. But I usually line my jackets just because I think they make them more elegant and they keep their shape better and they hang better.
So you're planning to do a show? Do I understand that
So
correctly?
so there's a studio tour that happens around, I guess it's the second weekend in November. So I was going to apply last year, and you really need to have a lot of stuff made, and you need to really be confident about what you're making. And I would take a year. And so I did, and I'm really glad I did because I was pushing myself to get it done. So I made my first jacket to show at a Chesapeake Fibershed gathering that was encouraging people to make stuff from local fiber. And so I went really well received and I met some really great people. And then so I've been working this year, like I said, just really getting the fabric that I want consistent. And so now I'm working on my third coat and about to make my fourth design. And then I'm going to I'm going to figure out how many I have to have before going into that show and will apply. So it is juried.
Is there anything I haven't asked you that you want to talk about?
I mean, I just am really excited about the whole Fibershed thing.
Well, great. We're getting to the end of our time, and this has been a great conversation. You're on Instagram? You have a website?
Yeah, I do. And both of them are called With Needle and Stick.
Well, this has been wonderful, and I'm thrilled that you are involved in the Fibershed movement because that seems to be growing in popularity. And as a
Yeah.
as a former hand spinner and hand knitter, I'm always thrilled when people are doing things with sheep and wool. So this has been great. I
Well,
really
great. I
appreciate you
appreciate you,
taking the time.
talking to me. It's been really
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Susan. I'm going to keep this ending short. You know what to do. Feedback either through the fan mail feature or email me at janet@janetzabo.com or leave a comment on the show notes page at the website, which is www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. And I will be back with you on the first Tuesday of 2025. So until then, I hope you have a great rest of 2024 and that you get to go sew something.